even at this stage of my life and my career, I still have this sort of little kid's joy at learning something new. And I am just grateful to be in a job, in a position, at a stage in my life where I'm still able to practice that. Because I'm not certain that everyone is so blessed to retain that sort of childlike wonder about the world.
Hello and welcome to the Beautiful Work Podcast. I am your host, Dan Krikorian. Each episode, we feature a special guest from all walks of life, and we ask them to explore the ins and outs, the ups and downs, the trials and the triumphs of their chosen field. Writers, musicians, coaches, business owners, and everything in between. We peel back the curtain to hear their stories, to walk their paths, to find out how they breathe life into their beautiful work. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to this edition of the Beautiful Work Podcast. Today's guest is David Staley, and he is a fascinating interview. Ohio State University professor and writer, and just came out with a terrific new book about speculative design for the future of higher education. It is a great read, and we have a really, really fun conversation. Before we get to that conversation, quick announcements. Thank you to those who have been going to iTunes to like and rate and leave a review for the Beautiful Work Podcast. We really appreciate that. That's really the best way for other folks to find us and to enjoy the content as well. So if you could continue to do that or pass it along to a friend, that is really one of the most helpful, if not the most helpful way to continue to grow the podcast. Another way, if you are interested in helping out the podcast, we do have a Patreon page where you can completely voluntarily, if you'd like, support the workings of the podcast for a couple of bucks a month or more, if you so choose. That is a Beautiful Work Podcast at Patreon. So Patreon/Beautiful Work Podcast. And you can find the different levels and tiers there if you are so inclined to want to contribute. As far as music goes, those of you that are new, I am also a musician. My fifth record, Grandeur, came out a few months ago. It's been doing great, especially over in Europe. We're continuing to get a great amount of radio play and reviews coming in. Just last month, it was called one of the top 10 albums of the year over in Belgium. And so we're getting ready. I am, and my wife and I are getting ready for a solo tour in June through July, 2.5 weeks in Germany, in the Netherlands and Belgium. I'll be over there on tour before coming back to play a bunch of shows in and around California and the West Coast. If you want to come see us and you are in the Orange County area, on May 25th from 1 to 3 p.m., we'll be out on the beautiful ocean deck in Huntington Beach at Pacific City. And then we'll be back at that same spot on June 8th from 5 to 7 p.m. at Pacific City. Well, once again, thank you guys for joining. I can't wait to bring you guys David's story. He's really, really fascinating to talk to, and I know you're going to enjoy him. So without further ado, let's get to the show. David Staley is the director of the Humanities Institute and an associate professor of history at The Ohio State University. His research interests include digital history, the philosophy of history, historical methodology, and the history and future of higher education. He has been published widely on the intersection of technology and scholarship, and is the author of books such as Brain, Mind, and Internet, and History and Future, using historical thinking to imagine the future. His newest work is Alternative Universities, Speculative Design for Innovation in Higher Education. From 2003 to 2008, Staley was the executive director of the American Association for History and Computing, and he continues to serve as lead editor for the association's book series titled History, the Humanities, and New Technology. David is here with us today to talk about the future of higher education, playing soccer into your 50s, and what it's like to get a burger named after you in Columbus, Ohio. Okay, I am joined this morning by David Staley. David, thank you very much for coming on the podcast this morning. It's great to have you.
Thank you very much, Dan.
All right, David, you have extensive work and research in future thinking and speculative design and things like that. But before we dive into that, are there any other hobbies or any other outside interests that people maybe don't know about you that you have besides those sorts of things?
Hobbies and outside interests. So I am, even at my age, I am still a competitive soccer player. In fact, I played a game last night.
Wow. Okay.
I played in a men's over 40 league on Sunday, a men's over 50 league on Monday nights, and I played co-ed over 50s on Thursday nights.
That's great. Now, were you a soccer player growing up?
Yeah, I was one of the first wave of kids in the 70s that got into soccer. So I started playing when I was about 13 and just realized the other day I've been playing for over 40 years.
Wow. I was a soccer player growing up myself. So what position are you, or do you find yourself playing mostly in these leagues?
You mean today, what do I do?
Right.
Because looking over 40 years, I've literally played every position.
Okay, good.
Today, I mostly play either right back or defensive midfield. Those are the two places I tend to end up.
Okay. Defensive mid's pretty fun because you're kind of always in the action.
Yeah. Right in the center thing. Literally right in the center.
You're right in the thick of it all. That's great. That's awesome. Hey, you teach at Ohio State and are a big part of that community there. What's for someone traveling through, what's one of the best places to get a burger in Columbus?
So I'll begin by saying I'm a vegetarian.
Of course they ask that question.
But there is a place I go to get burgers, and it's here on campus, and they just opened up another location in closer to downtown, but it's called Hangover Easy. And they make just a terrific black bean burger, but you got to get it with tater tots.
Okay.
Yeah, you got to get it with tater tots. And it's really funny that you mentioned burger because I guess I'll tell you the other place. Although you can't get it yet, you'll get it in September. So there's a diner here on campus called Sloopy's.
Okay.
Get it, like hang on Sloopy. There's a diner here on campus, and I was just given an award the other day. For the next academic year, the veggie burger sandwich is named after me.
That's a high honor.
So if you're going to get a burger in Columbus, you got to go to Sloopy's and order the David Staley veggie burger.
Now that's something. Now you've made it now.
I have definitely made it. I've had a lot of accolades in my career. This might be the biggest.
That's great. Let's talk about your work, and there's a lot to get into, and I guess I'll start with, you've been such a great future thinker and speculative design, and there's a lot of work that you've done with that, and the book that we'll get into that recently came out, Alternative Universities, has a lot about that. But where does your passion stem from in thinking about the future and speculating about the future?
So what I tell people, so I'm trained as an historian. I have a PhD in history, teach history here among other things. But as a kid growing up, I really wasn't a history buff.
Uh-huh.
In fact, if anything, I was a science fiction buff. Practically anything I read, when I did read, was around science fiction. And of course, that was just something I liked to pursue as a kid. It was between after I graduated high school, but before I started college. I had a job selling produce by the side of the road in the town I grew up in. Guy hired me to do that for the summer, and there were lulls in the day. Let's put it that way. Very active in the morning, very active in the afternoon. A lot of lulls in between there. And that summer, I read all 3 of the books of the Foundation trilogy by Isaac Asimov.
Okay.
And the centerpiece of the Foundation trilogy was this science called psychohistory that used essentially statistical analysis to predict the future. And that was the whole basis of the 3 books, the efficacy and then the great challenge that this science represented. And as I read this, I said, boy, this is what I want to do. I want to study the future. This is the sort of thing I want to do. And then, of course, I got to college and couldn't study the future because there is no major called future studies or future or something like that. So after spending some time in economics, I finally ended up in history, which actually proved to be really fortuitous, especially to be a futurist, because as I argue in one of my books, I think being an historian is actually the best training for being a futurist, for being someone to think about the future. But if I had to confess, if I had to guess, I spend as much time in the future as I do. I spend as much time studying the future as I do studying the past. And then I can. There was something that happened in graduate school that really set me on the path, I think, toward being a futurist. And I'm happy to share that if you want to hear that story.
Please.
So my PhD is in German history, and I was working on my PhD in the late 80s and early 90s at a time when a lot of it was happening in Germany, right? The Berlin Wall fell, and then, of course, 2 Germanys united a year later. And I had a graduate advisor who wanted us to be conversant, aware of current events, and not just simply studying the past. And so he would get all of his students, all the German historians, we would meet every Friday afternoon. And over the course of the week, we were supposed to read 1 newspaper. So I remember, or 2. I read the Wall Street Journal. I read the Christian Science Monitor. And we just got together every Friday, and the question was, what's happening in Germany? And we would just have a conversation about because a lot of things were happening in that time. And so I remember, for instance, one of the things that I was keeping track on was this was after the wall fell, but before unification. West German companies were partnering, and I'm putting that in air quotes, partnering with East German companies. And what that really meant was sort of buying them up and especially tapping into their supply chains. And the conclusion I drew from that is, even though there's not unification yet, unification is already sort of happening on the ground. And we looked at all sorts of other things as well about what the costs of unification would be. Our group determined it was going to be much more expensive than what German politicians were saying. And it turns out we were right. So fast forward to a family event I'm attending, and my wife's cousin, is making small talk with me. He says, "What's going on in Germany?" So I told him about all the things that we were sort of studying and investigating. And he said, "This is really fascinating. We ought to have you come in and talk to the leadership of my company, because we do a lot of business in Germany." And I said, "Really?" "Really?" I said, "Look, all I did was read the newspaper." And he said, "Well, yeah, but you can help us make sense of all that stuff." And I realized at that moment that there were people that would be interested in what I had to say about sort of the present and the future, because of my background knowledge in history, but also because I knew how to make sense of what was there in the news. And that was sort of one of the causes, I suppose, one of the first instances of what ultimately became a consulting practice in futuring and foresight, doing exactly that sort of work with companies and organizations.
Well, it's a really interesting story, how you get into it, and makes me think a little bit. And we'll get into your book in a second, but one of the proposed models, the liberal arts college you talk about, one of the key elements is sense making that you talk about. And so kind of tying into what you were just saying about your ability to do that was obviously beneficial for you.
Some of that was biographical. Some of that chapter was biographical, as you can imagine.
One of the things that's interesting to me about what you've said in some of your talks and what you write about is this concept of creative proximity or domain hopping. And, you yourself coming from a history background, but also having economics and things like that, can you maybe explain a little deeper what those things are and why they're so beneficial for education?
Yeah. So I gave a TEDx talk here in Columbus. I guess it's been 9 years ago now, where the theme was the future, and they wanted me to talk about sort of the future of Columbus. And I decided that I didn't want to, give them a trends forecast of the kind of work I would typically do. I wanted to do something that was more visionary, more than sort of predictive. And so I said what I wanted to do was to imagine the future of the city of Columbus. And I began by saying this city in particular, and you have to know something about the culture of Columbus, for a long time, and I think it's only been in the last couple of years that we've gotten away from this, but we were very keen to benchmark other cities. We have to be like Indianapolis. We have to be like Charlotte. We have to be like Portland. And I basically said to the group, why are we benchmarking these other cities? But I said, if we're going to benchmark, if we're going to try to be like some great city, so let's swing for the fences. Let's not even be New York or San Francisco. Let's be Renaissance Florence. Let's be Florence at the time of Leonardo da Vinci and Brunelleschi and these guys. And so the talk was basically about what was it about that city in the Italian Renaissance that produced all that creativity. And it turns out that city and other cities and other organizations can be incredibly creative because they have this thing, as you say, that I call creative proximity. So in other words, it means that there's a lot of mashing up of all kinds of different people and ideas that are sort of different from each other and probably didn't realize they needed to be connected. So there are a lot of people who work on creativity that say that the genesis of creativity is connecting ideas, this thing and this thing, connecting them together to produce something new. And especially when this thing and this thing are divergent or different from each other. So the example I give is Miyamoto, the guy from Nintendo, who took a Nintendo game console and added an accelerometer, which is the device that's in the steering column of your car that activates the airbag. Well, what does an accelerometer have to do with a Nintendo console? Well, when you put these two things together, you get Wii. And that, of course, completely changed Nintendo and upended the gaming industry. Taking two disparate ideas and smashing them together produced something that was really creative. And what I said in that talk, and what I've said and written elsewhere, is that cities can certainly create that kind of infrastructure. That a city itself can have can smash together ideas and people, especially disparate ideas and people, and the city itself can be the sort of engine of creativity. And I think the same can be applied to organizations too. It doesn't have to be citywide. Or there are certain organizations that practice this as well, and that organizations can foster this kind of creative proximity.
Yeah, I thought it was a great talk, and it seemed like since the 9 years since, any of the things that you talked about, have you seen play out in any sense around Columbus and Ohio State?
So yeah, we by we I mean a collection of faculty here at Ohio State began this very, very informal club. I mean that's probably the best way to describe it. But it was this interdisciplinary group of faculty that where it really began by, going out for drinks every Friday night, that sort of thing. But that group then sort of formalized into what we call the STEAM factory. STEAM, like science, technology, engineering, arts, mathematics. But it is this interdisciplinary center that exists largely to connect people across different disciplines, people that didn't realize that they were working on similar ideas, or that by working together they could produce new or creative ideas. The term I use, or you used it earlier, is domain bridging. And all that means is taking an idea from this domain, from one over here, and bringing it over to another domain. And then you produce something new. An example I like to give is the trumpeter Miles Davis, who said that he got ideas for phrasing the trumpet by listening to Frank Sinatra and Orson Welles, right? A singer and an actor. In other words, not necessarily listening to other trumpeters. He would go to an actor to hear how he would phrase certain roles and bring those ideas into playing the trumpet. And that's an example of the sort of thing I mean. So we've got that sort of creative environment here in the STEAM Factory, and that's one of my favorite organizations here on campus.
Yeah, and I can just, in going through and reading your book and the different ideas for all the different platforms and alternative universities, I can see the interweaving of a lot of different disciplines, which I'm sure came from some of your conversations with the STEAM Factory folks. And so maybe this is a good time to jump into your newest work, Alternative Universities, Speculative Design for Innovation in Higher Education. And I will let you, I guess, maybe give a brief overview of what the book is, and then we can start diving deeper into some of the concepts behind it.
So the simple statement is that the book is 10 what-if exercises. And the what-if question I ask is, what if we organize the university differently? Or what if we organize it like this instead of this? Speculative design is a practice that we do in design, and I hold a courtesy appointment in the design department, which is where I learned about or got these ideas. But speculative design is to design something, but for purposes of question asking or exploration, or indeed provocation in some cases. So you design a system, you design a product, you design an object, whatever the case is. And it's not because it's necessarily going to be practical, but you use it as a way to explore and to maybe even to create something new. And so I took that idea of speculative design and applied it to the university, the idea of a university. And I guess the origins of the book were, well, the origins come from, I guess, from lots of different directions. One of which is from a scholar of higher education, a philosopher of higher education, named Ronald Barnett, who has made the charge that our ideas about what universities can become are, in his words, hopelessly impoverished, meaning that we have this very, very narrow range of ideas about what universities can be and what they can become. And his argument in particular is that universities look too much the same. They look too much like either the online university or the entrepreneurial university, but it's this very narrow sort of conception of what universities can become. And his charge was that scholars of higher education and university presidents and others need to think more imaginatively about what universities can be. And then he sort of leaves it off at that. So I took up that challenge. I said, okay, I'm going to apply my imagination. What could we do? What could we imagine differently about what universities can be? I've done research, or I have an interest in people who have founded universities in the past. So people like John Andrew Rice, who founded Black Mountain College in North Carolina. I have an interest in people like Alexander Michaeljohn. He started an experimental college at University of Wisconsin. there's a whole host of these people. Justin Morrill, who was the founder, the father of the Morrill Land Grant Act that produced a university like Ohio State. So I've become interested in sort of studying their personalities, people who start schools. What is it that they were trying to do? Were they just simply trying to start something, just another school like everybody else? Every one of these cases, these were people that were reimagining what a university can be, or college or university can be. And so I take a lot of inspiration from them. And then I guess a third sort of reason why I started exploring this book is that it's probably been about 6 or 7 years ago, I was working with a partner on designing a new kind of, we developed a business plan. We were going to design a new kind of online university, and actually started to secure funds for this. And that never panned out. We couldn't get the funding round that we had hoped for. But I love that exercise. For me, it was just a tremendous intellectual exercise, imagining, planning, designing a university from scratch. And so I think that is something that underlies this book as well. The question, what if you could design your own university today from scratch? What would it look like?
Yeah, and it's a fascinating read and thought experiment, especially someone like myself who I see it every single day. And one of the other questions I wanted to ask you is, why now do you feel like this book is important for higher education at this kind of pivotal point in history, that something like this is good for people to think about moving forward?
Boy, that's an excellent question, Dan. So because some might say this is exactly the wrong time to imagine new kinds of universities, because boy, every day we pick up the higher education press, the Chronicle, Inside Higher Ed, and we hear about another small college that's closing its doors or that's in financial trouble. And so one could say, look, we don't need new universities because the ones we have seem to be declining. There are others that would claim, look, the university as an institution has lots of challenges. You know, the fact that 3/4 of the professorate are contingent or adjunct, are not full-time, don't have the commitment of the institution attached to them. There are those that say this is a demonstration of a broken system and that we need to repair what we have, not necessarily thinking new. I can sort of easily, or I think I can easily counter that. And one of the ways I do is to say that one of the challenges that we face in higher education, and one that isn't always recognized, I think, is that there's a growing lack of differentiation between a lot of institutions. And what I mean by that is more and more institutions are starting to look identical to each other, such that there is one scholar that says that higher education is becoming a commoditized industry, which means that all the competitors look alike, and therefore all they can do is compete on price. And I think that lack of differentiation really is a concern. So I had occasion to drive to Indianapolis to visit family, for instance, and also to parts of Northwest Ohio. There's a lot of colleges and universities in that area. And one of the things I'm struck with are their billboard advertisements, and all of them feature, in some guise, the word you, Y-O-U. Such and such university. It's all about you. Thinking of you, your experience. And that's the sort of thing I mean, that the marketing of a lot of colleges and universities is starting to look identical. And then these same colleges and universities say, come here because we have business administration, or come here because we have athletic training. To which I say, yeah, and so does your competitor down the street. Why should I send my child? Why should a student attend this university? And so I think it's in that sort of environment that we really do need to start thinking about differentiation, about a sort of a different function of a university as a way for some colleges and universities to compete in the marketplace, to be really fundamentally different from a lot of from their competitors, from other institutions. And you would certainly get that if you were to put in practice the 10 models that I have in this book. You would certainly be differentiated.
Right. Well, maybe this is a good time. Just for reference for everybody listening, so we can kind of talk about a couple of these. I'm just going to run through a quick of the 10 platforms. And forgive me for just the brevity of it, but we'll get much more into it. But you have them organized into 4 kind of groupings. So the first 3 are about organization, and you have a platform, which is organized and managed organically with decisions arrived at through the unregulated interactions of teachers and students. The second one is micro colleges, which is 1 professor and about 20 students, and the curriculum is unique to that professor. Number 3 is humanities think tank. So it's staffed and led by scholars from the humanities disciplines, and it's intended to produce policy making. Then the next grouping is apprenticeship, and you have Nomad University there, which is organized like a series of gap years experiences, and you'd have 8 to 10 gap years. You'd work under the guidance of a faculty member and immerse in the local culture, and then move on to another experience. Number 5 is a liberal arts college, and it's centered on the skills rather than subjects. And you have 7 skills: complex problem solving, sense making, imagination, multimodal communication, cross-cultural competency, and leadership. The next grouping is technology, which these are fascinating. Number 6 is interface university, based on the idea that the future of cognition will be a hybrid between AI and human intelligence, and the students will learn the standard courses and standard majors, but learn to partner with algorithms. Number 7 is the university of the body. And so at this point, the world exists in external media. So media has moved off electronic screens into the surrounding environment, and they develop literacy to decode and compose in a world of external media. And the last grouping are attributes. So the 8th model is the Institute of Advanced Play, about the generation of new and advanced knowledge. And imagination is more highly valued than knowledge and encouraged serious play. Number 9 is Polymath University. Every student majors in 3 different disciplines: 1 science, 1 art or humanities, and 1 professional. And the last one is Future University. So students live and think about the future, visualizing it to better design and build the future. And the curriculum is balanced between pure futuring and applied futuring. That is a quick bullet point of your 10. And so people have reference. I try to do my homework. So my question to you, and they're all just really fascinating. I really enjoyed going through them and thinking about them. If you yourself had unlimited resources to put into 1 or 2 or 3 of these designs, which ones might you start with?
So there's 3 I think that immediately leap to mind in that. So the first I'd say is Polymath University, because I think in some ways that would be the easiest to institute today, although not without its challenges. So as you say, the idea of Polymath University it's actually based on this idea of creative proximity and domain bridging. That's the sort of the central feature of it. So as you say, the purpose behind Polymath University is that every student triple majors in 3 very different subjects, and they have a menu to choose from. You gave the organization. So the sciences, that includes the social sciences, the arts and humanities, and then professions. So someone wouldn't triple major in, say, history, English, philosophy, or they wouldn't triple major in accounting, finance, and business administration. Instead, they major in business administration, history, and theater. Those would be the 3, or that would be one sort of combination. And the idea of this is based around, and I guess just sort of to finish the thought, the way that you get that done in 4 years is there's no general education, or in a sense, the general education is embedded in really immersing yourself in 3 different disciplines. And again, the idea here, and so the idea behind Polymath University is based on some research that looks at students who double major, and in particular double major in what are called stretch disciplines. So again, not history and English, but students that are double majoring in, say, theater, and
Mm-hmm.
finance. That's that sort of stretch, and it has to. The studies have to do with the kind of mind that's produced, the kind of creative mind that's produced, because these are students that sort of learn to see the world or to attack problems from two different vantage points, and are able to toggle back and forth between two habits of mind, really. And so the whole idea behind Polymath University is you introduce even more complexity by adding a third element to this. And again, it's not without its challenges. I think it would be difficult for a pre-existing institution to do it, largely because it would be hard to get accreditor approval to not have general education, for instance. But I think it's a sort of thing that an institution could start tomorrow. And is one I would like to start. The second one is micro college. I'm particularly fascinated by micro college. And again, I think you could start this tomorrow. Although again, it would have challenges associated with it. So as you say, the idea behind micro college is that it is made up of one faculty member and 20 students, which sounds a little out there, until you realize that there are a few models like that already in higher education today, the most famous of which is Deep Springs College in the Sierra Nevada mountains. So it has 3 faculty plus guest faculty and 27 students, and that's been the case for a century now. And so that sort of model exists. You could also see historical examples of this. In some ways, the idea of micro college is based on the system of gurus in India. That was the educational system before the British arrived, before British imperialism, before the British Raj. It would be one guru and say 24 students, and that would be the school. And so this style of education actually has deep historical roots, but we just don't practice it as much today. The micro colleges I envision it would have to include what I call electronic tutors. So in other words, instruction would have to come from more than just a single professor. The professor certainly does that. In fact, what I'm imagining is sort of a weekly lecture for the entire college. But then students would also work individually on technology, especially adaptive learning technology, which exists today. I mean, these tools exist today. And adaptive learning simply means that as you're taking a course, the learning, the lessons are geared to your level, to a student's level, and it's sort of like a video game. You level up as you move through a course, and students move through courses at different paces. And then it would also be tutorials. So the faculty member would meet individually or in groups of like 3 or 4 with students once a week, like an Oxford tutorial. And then there would be peer teaching and peer mentoring. And I think, and the idea is that a micro college, there'd be lots and lots and lots of micro colleges. There wouldn't be just one. You'd have lots and lots of these. And they might be located in a pre-existing institution. So an art museum might start a micro college, or an architecture firm might start one. In fact, I'm talking with I've started a talk with a nonprofit here in Columbus about starting a micro college. We have the largest maker space in the country here in Columbus, and so I've started a conversation with them about starting a micro college. And then the third one, I think, is the liberal arts college, the example that you listed. And again, I think it's something that could be started today, but again, with challenges. Would probably be unaccredited, and that has all kinds of challenges. Or getting accreditation, I think, would be hard, just because accreditation enforces a certain kind of model. And most of the universities that I explore in alternative universities, by definition, don't fit the model. And so at the liberal arts college, students learn 7 subjects, seven skills, not disciplines. So the skills they learn are complex problem solving, sense making, imagination, multimodal communication, cross-cultural competency, leadership. So you don't take classes in subjects. You don't take psychology or business, or you take, in a sense, you learn these skills. And the way that you do that is by a series of internships. There's some classroom instruction, but most of it occurs by placing students in internships. And the idea is the internship would teach leadership, or you would engage in multimodal communication. You would be in an internship with an organization where you would practice imagination. And so the liberal arts, in a sense, are sort of redefined from the way that we've sort of traditionally understood them.
Yeah, and those three to me stuck out as well as potentially even just a modern university might be able to take bits and pieces of those and add them to what they currently do. Myself, man, I thought the Nomad University, where you're taking 8 to 10, kind of gap year type courses, experiences, would just be an enjoyable experience. I'm thinking going to 8 to 10 different places or countries and getting that immersive experience would be like study abroad on steroids, it sounds like.
Exactly, yes. So there's all kinds of research that says that students who take a gap year between high school and college come to college better prepared, more mature, ready to engage in academic work than those who don't. And so I asked the question, well, if gap year experiences like that are so beneficial, what if that became the basis then of a university experience? Yeah. So Nomad University doesn't have classrooms, it doesn't have buildings, maybe it has an office somewhere, but in a sense the university moves around the globe.
Yeah.
Worked on projects for 6 months or so. And you put together a series of these, and that becomes the university experience.
Yeah, it's great. And I don't want to go down too much of a rabbit hole, because I know this next question probably could, but there's two models that you have that are based off of kind of future technology and artificial intelligence, and that's Interface University and University of the Body. Maybe just you could comment on artificial intelligence and where you think it's going in conjunction with education, and why those universities, might be important in the future.
So a lot of the talks I'm giving now has to do with artificial intelligence. Boy, it seems I'm asked, almost every week to give a talk someplace about the future of artificial intelligence, because people, and they come from all over the place, even professional organizations want to know, is artificial intelligence going to take away my job?
Mm-hmm.
And worse in some cases, right? There are those that are predicting that AI is going to have no use for humanity once it becomes super intelligent. That's not my view of the future. I don't necessarily. It's a possibility, I think, but it's not a certainty that AI is going to sort of take over all jobs. And in fact, I think a more realistic view, more probable view of the future is that AI will be asked to perform a lot of tasks, but that so will we as human beings. And I think that what's more likely to happen is that we will partner with artificial intelligence to engage in all kinds of cognitive acts. At present, there's no educational system that teaches people how to interface with artificial intelligence. We do it sort of haphazardly, I suppose, in the way that you ask a question of your Alexa device, for instance. But I think in the future, and I really do believe this, that we will have to learn to interact and to think with artificial intelligence in the same way that today we learn to think with books. And in the way that education has, at least since the 19th century, been about how to interact, how to think with books, that we will have to have educational institutions that will do the same with artificial intelligence. And so that's the idea behind Interface University, that it's about achieving that sort of cognitive interface between human and artificial intelligence.
Albert Einstein once said, "I have no special talent. I am only passionately curious." David Staley has made a career of being passionately curious, of looking at both the future and the rearview mirror, at turning things on their side, shaking them up, pulling them apart, and reassembling them to see if there might be a better way. One of the concepts David speaks about that hits home for me is the idea of domain bridging, of the ability and willingness to cross into different fields of thought or expertise and tie them together for the better. Some of the world's greatest thinkers and creators often hopped from science and math to art and writing and painting and on and on. Leonardo da Vinci famously painted masterpieces while at the same time used math and engineering to design early automatic weapons and flying machines. And Art Garfunkel, while bringing down the house with Simon and Garfunkel, also holds a master's degree in math from Columbia University and was teaching geometry to high schoolers the year he won a Grammy. In David's book, many of the ideas for future universities centers around the thought of the student being immersed in a variety of different disciplines and experiences, an attempt perhaps to produce a future generation who are less specialized, but, like David, develop depth in multiple areas to ultimately bridge gaps, keep that childlike wonder, and see the connectivity of it all. As the Japanese proverb goes, you cannot see the whole world through a bamboo tube. Looking at all of these models and potential universities, what do you think the trickle-down effect would be at, say, the high school and middle school level? Because if those are kind of stuck in the same old systems of how they teach and the SAT and those standards, and then you have these new higher education models, can you see these models moving to younger and younger educational systems?
Boy, that is such a good question, Dan. And I'd like to think that was the case. The challenge, though, is that I think I'm not certain that such trickle down happens today.
Mm-hmm.
I think in some ways there are some real disconnects between higher education and K through 12 education. And so I get a little bit of experience on the ground. I've worked like in teacher professional development. I've consulted on curriculum development for our state education administration here in Ohio. And one of the things that I've seen again and again and again is the kind of disconnect between sort of our expectations or what we do in higher education versus the reality of K through 12 education, especially around the testing regime, especially around that. That kind of system hasn't yet come to higher education, I think, thankfully, but neither have we been able to influence or to change the trajectory of the testing regime. And I'll expose my bias here, I think infects K through 12 education. Yeah. I would like to think that the ideas that I'm exploring here in alternative universities would be inspirational to educators in the K through 12 level. And I think that there are certainly pockets of that, but when we talk about like public education, for instance, there are just simply too many institutional roadblocks to innovation. If we think that universities are slow to innovate, I think that innovation comes even harder to K through 12 education.
Great.
But it's a lovely thought. I would love for that to be the case. And now you've got me thinking in other directions, and maybe I need to start addressing this book to K through 12 audiences.
Right, there you go. Well, good. Yeah, it was just interesting to me to think about, because my wife and my brother are involved in high school, counseling and school psychology, and I have been a coach at the high school level. So just interesting to think about, if these were designed at the high school level, how great that would be.
Well, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here, because I was part of a group of educational designers that was working on. So we were working with a private institution in Atlanta about devising a sort of a project-based curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
So students learn by working on projects, right? And after 3 days of workshopping with this, and it was a fantastic experience, at the end, I said, great, this should be the way in which your curriculum is designed, completely around projects. And there was this kind of bewildered look on everyone's face, which was, well, no, this could be a nice add-on, but we still have to do the curriculum as we traditionally do it. We're still required to do that. We can do this as sort of like an after-school activity. And I said, I think you completely missed the point. You developed an entire new curriculum around learning by doing, and yet it gets shunted off as something that's almost like an extracurricular activity, not fundamentally changing the curriculum. That's part of where my frustration. You're hearing frustration in my voice. That's where some of this comes from.
That's okay. How do you feel? So right now, as we speak, there's the FBI probe that's gone on with the admission scandals to some of the elite universities. And I'm not asking you to comment at all on that, but maybe thinking about how your 10 models might be able to sidestep some of those pitfalls that the higher academic universities are seeing now, and also have the ability to maybe capture some of the high-end talent that at times can be missed from lower socioeconomic students in places that they just don't have the means to apply to these colleges or get left behind. How could these models allow for more of those types of students to have access to higher education?
So it's obviously a very, very, very complex kind of question around the admission scandal. But I think that one of the root issues goes back to this question of differentiation. The schools that these people were trying to bribe to get their kids in, we identify as elite, right? Not every school was there, and there's a reason for that. That we identify some schools as elite versus others. So USC and Harvard and I think University of Texas was there. And one of the things that sets these apart as elite institutions has to do with differentiation. The assumption is that Harvard isn't like other universities. USC isn't like any other institution, and that there's something about that institution that marks them as distinct and different. Else, why is everyone else trying to get into these institutions? In a way that the community college doesn't have to, that just simply isn't a consideration for the community college. Because the perception is there's something that these institutions provide or do that other institutions cannot. And it largely has to do, I think, with a certain kind of signaling, a certain kind of, to get into Harvard signals something, and to have a Harvard degree signals something in the workplace in a way that, at a regional public university doesn't signal the same way. But I'd also like to think that at some of these institutions, there's a distinct kind of education that one gains. And one of the things that I write in the book is that I try to encourage this. I think I've done it successfully. I think that the alternative universities that I explore here are alternative around the transformational experience that they represent. And so I draw a distinction between institutions of higher education that provide transactional experiences versus transformational
Yeah.
experiences. And by transactional, I mean literally, I pay you money and tuition, you certify me with skills, and I graduate. And I am the same person plus skills. I am old enough, I think, that higher education to me was always going to be a transformational experience, or at least that's what I wanted. That I assumed that after 4 years of higher education, I was going to be transformed. I was going to be a different person than the person I was when I arrived. Either, more mature or more knowledgeable or with more wisdom or whatever the case is, but that it was to be a transformational experience. And I think that frankly, especially, well, I don't want to mention any specifics, but especially online universities are really selling a transactional experience more than a transformational experience. And so I think that one of the ways that we could address some of the challenges that led to this admission scandal is to think about broadening transformational experiences, the availability of transformational experiences.
That's great. Well, it's a fascinating read, and I'll make sure I have places for people to find it and to continue to read into it about speculative design.
Thank you. My publisher will be happy too.
Yes, I will make sure. Pivoting a little bit now towards just your general career as an educator and as a thinker of the future. What are some of the traits or characteristics that you think has allowed you to sustain excellence over the course of your career?
Curiosity and imagination. No one's ever asked it exactly as you have, Dan. And so you might think that my response was sort of canned or something like that, but it's not. But in asking it that way, you immediately triggered. So I think of myself as a intensely, even pathologically curious person.
Uh-huh.
And I define curiosity as being interested in something because it's interesting. And that, I think, has been something that's driven me throughout my career. I tend to think about, write about, explore things that I just find interesting. Which means I'm not easily identified as a specialist. At a place like Ohio State, a Research One institution like Ohio State, that can pose some challenges. But as you've sort of indicated here, I've worked in and I'm interested in lots of things. I'm interested in history. I'm interested in the future. I'm interested in design. I'm interested in visualization. My first book was on visualization in history. So I do digital history.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote a book on the brain-mind interface. The brain-internet interface. Because it was something interesting and it was something that I wanted to explore. So I think curiosity has really driven a lot of my work.
Sure.
And imagination. I am unabashedly an imaginative person.
Uh-huh.
And again, we tend to associate imagination with sort of childlike or childish behavior. And as you grow up, you're supposed to lose your imagination. But to me, the most important thinkers have always had rich and well-developed imaginations, and I have always allowed my imagination to drive my research interests.
And someone like yourself that is as creative and imaginative as you are, how do you continue to feed your brain or to learn? Are you books, podcasts, videos? What's your way of learning for yourself?
Yes to all of those. Although if I had to rank them, it's books first. I'm a pathological reader of books.
Uh-huh.
And again, I read widely. This was something that I already possessed. It was a trait I already possessed. I mentioned my PhD advisor, who is similarly a very curious domain bridger. And he encouraged all of his students, but me in particular, to read widely, and I've always done that. So I've got a book on my reading on my pile right now on being an orchestra conductor, because because I just think it's very interesting to know something about this, but I'm also interested in this from the vantage point of leadership. What are the leadership implications of what conductors do? And I don't know where that's going to end up, where I'm going with this. I'm sort of at work on a project on the relationship between futuring and leadership, so maybe it ends up there.
Okay.
But that's just an example of how I try to read widely, and I try to pick up books, magazines, podcasts in areas I've never read or studied in before. I just find it just because I'm curious.
Any favorites that stick out that our listeners might point them towards?
So my favorite podcast is On Being, Krista Tippett's.
Yes. Yep.
One, because the subject is just something interesting, and as someone who hosts his own podcast, I just find her inspirational as a host, and so I've always sort of tried to learn from her. I think. Books, boy, I could talk for another hour on books.
Yeah, I know it's a rabbit hole.
It is a rabbit hole. So one of the things, I'll talk in genres. I've become very interested in biography lately, and have been try to have at least one biography on my nightstand. And I just finished reading a biography, for instance, of Herbert Simon, the polymath Nobel Prize winner in economics. But the last memoir I read before that was Tracy Thorn, the singer Tracy Thorn, from the group Everything But the Girl.
Okay.
Which was just fantastic.
Well, good. As we kind of round third base here in the interview, there's a couple of questions that I like to ask every guest, and the first one is you can take this kind of any way that you want, but what is one of the best investments that you've made in your career?
One of the best investments I've made in my career. Giving myself permission to aspire to be a polymath. I won't call myself a polymath, although other people have called me that. But as I say, at a research one institution, it's hard to do that. But I think that giving myself permission to do that has been a positive investment.
That's great. The last question, you are involved in so many different things, and you've got a lot going on. But when you put your head on the pillow at night, what is about your work that brings you the most joy and the most meaning in your life?
I think that would have to be the joy of learning. That even at this stage of my life and my career, I still have this sort of little kid's joy at learning something new, and I am just grateful to be in a job, in a position, at a stage in my life where I'm still able to practice that. Because I'm not certain that everyone is so blessed to retain that sort of childlike wonder about the world.
That's great. And obviously you can see that throughout all your work and all the things that you talk about and do. And it's very apparent that you do that full steam ahead. Thank you so much for being so candid and open about your work and life and things that you do. I want to leave you a little bit of time here to talk or to point our listeners to where they can find your work, where they can buy the book, where they can buy your other books. So where should they go to follow you and find your work?
So the easiest way for the books, I think, is Amazon. I could point you to each one of the individual publishers, but it's probably easiest to go through Amazon. And then I think an easy way to sort of connect to me generally would be like through Twitter, and I am at David Staley 8, and there's a lot of ways you can see the sorts of things that I'm working on there. I'll tweet about my podcasts. I write a column about the future that I always post there. So that's probably the easiest way to do it.
Okay, perfect. Well, if I ever make it to Columbus, Ohio. I will try to find you and see if I can get a David Staley burger. David, is there anything else that you'd like to add? I'll give you the last word as we close out the podcast.
Only that I really enjoyed this experience. I really enjoyed the conversations. I appreciate people who ask good questions and who are good listeners, because it's what I try to achieve in my podcast. And you certainly fit that bill, Dan.
Thank you very much. It's very high praise. I appreciate that, David. And I look forward to connecting with you again and seeing all that you do. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Man, that was such a interesting and thought-provoking interview with David Staley from Ohio State University. We thank him for coming on, and please make sure you check out his newest book, Alternative Universities, and go check him out online, all that he's done, and his TED Talk, and you will not be disappointed. If you're interested in more of the episodes for the Beautiful Work podcast, please visit our website, dankrikorian.com or beautifulworkpodcast.com. They take you to the same spot. And while you're there, please consider joining up for our newsletter, where once a month I send you information about this podcast, as well as music and news and things like that. Would really appreciate if you guys do. As well, please share this with a friend. Like it, rate it, pass it along for free. That really helps to keep the podcast going. Well, till next time, whatever you're doing, wherever you are, keep making that beautiful work. We'll see you soon. Hey everyone, welcome to the super secret ending. If you're still listening, you either forgot to turn off the podcast, are a big fan, or you're my mom. Any of those options, thanks so much. Glad to have you here. This podcast is a labor of love, and I absolutely love bringing the stories of so many people to light and working on the production of it. It does take time, and it does take energy, and if you are so inclined to want to support what it takes to run the podcast, please consider going to patreon.com/beautifulworkpodcast to help support. That's patreon.com/beautifulworkpodcast, and you can sign up for $1, $2, $3, $4, $5 a month or more and get some cool things along with it, and it really helps with some of the production costs to run this podcast. Coming soon, end of May, early June, we have a full week planned diving deep into the whiskey and bourbon industry, and I've been putting together the shows and the interviews with many folks all around the globe that have to do with the making of bourbon and whiskey, selling, online, historians, you name it. I've been so fortunate to talk to them, and so I'm excited about that show and more to come. But in the meantime, thank you guys so much, and this is The Real Ending. We'll see you soon.